Hello and welcome back to Scouching's 2022 NHL Draft Recap Series. Today we are looking at the Los Angeles Kings, and the Kings were, they've been a very interesting team to watch draft over the last few years, but I don't know what changed this year. I trust them a lot based on how they've drafted, but I want to see where we're at in 5 years, because between last season's crop with guys like Kirill Kirsanov, Samuel Hellenius, and others, and this year's crop, I'm not exactly sure what the direction is for the Kings or what the angle is, but let's get right into it. So they took Jack Hughes at 51, and I really liked the pickup of Hughes. So I had him at 32 on my board. On average, he was at 42, and he went 51st. And I mean, on paper, that's good value. I think he flew under the radar, playing on a team where he didn't really produce all that well. The data that I tracked on him wasn't great. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. Like, it was worse than Jack Devine, for example. But this is why the track data isn't what I rely on. It's just a part of what I rely on. And with Jack Hughes, I really do think there's a lot to work with, though. He's got some skill. He's a high-paced player, creative, really interesting footwork around the ice that I think he needs to just refine. But I really think that there's a lot to like with regards to Jack Hughes' upside. I really liked him last year. I think that the jump to the NCAA can be quite a bit for a skill guy like this at a young age. So I'll be really curious to see if he has a good year with Northeastern this year. I mean, I assume he will. My prognosis for him, I would just like to see him, control pucks with a little bit more control. Like, he kind of barely holds onto it right now, skating himself into pressure and not really having the ability to problem solve through it. But in terms of making himself an open target, pass receptions, making plays, doing all those things, I think he does it pretty well. They drafted Kenny Connors at 103. I had seen a little bit of him over the course of the year, but not a ton, because I wasn't really taken with his game, and I was surprised to see him go off the board at 103. I didn't really find him to be particularly skilled or really high pace in terms of pushing guys onto their heels, but I found that he had a pretty strong wrist shot, and overall he's a well-rounded USHL player. You can stash him in college. He's going to UMass Amherst, and he'll get lots of chances to prove himself. And if there's training development and if they like the work ethic that he brings to the table, I can't say it's impossible. I just don't see a ton that screams NHL player right now. And speaking of which, Angus Booth. If you want to see a guy who scores on the power play a ton, you can watch Angus Booth. I did not really think much of his game this year. Tons of his production came at even strength. On the power play, and I just didn't see a ton of skill as a defenseman there. I didn't see a ton of creativity, I don't know. I watched him a few times this year because people were asking me about him and his scoring and everything. I just didn't see much there, and I wish I knew that, with guys like this who score, part of me is like, well, he played on a really good team, he played on the power play, put the puck on net, or pass the puck to like Maverick Bourque or Xavier Bourgault, or name whoever you want, and they finish the job for him, because I didn't really see much from Booth. And at 116, again, I look at a guy, I keep saying it in every video, but I look at a guy like Angus Booth based on what I've seen, and a guy like Vladimir Gradinin, and I don't really know how you come to the conclusion of one being of Booth ahead of Gradinin, but I understand there's a lot more going on there. But still, even then, at 116, we can expand it. I just was not a fan of Angus Booth, and I'm sure you can infer that from the number of times I've said so. But who got drafted that I had ranked? So Cedric Guindon, I would have Ryan Healy 100 times over a guy like Angus Booth. Alex Bump, I could have been convinced about. They took Otto Salin, who I had ranked higher, which we can get to in a minute. Fabian Wagner, Matthew Semenoff, Sergei Petrovsky, Alex Pelovin. There's a lot of options that I would have much rather pushed for over this guy, Angus Booth. But you never know, and we'll see what happens. And with that, we go to Otto Salin at 148. Now, I know everybody's looking at that NHLE score of 27. I've seen all the posts on Twitter about his model draft ranking of being, a top 15 guy, easy first round guy. I mean, look, the guy played 17 games total this year in club play. He did score quite a bit at the junior level, and granted, most of those games were after the junior league splits in Finland, and his team was in the top group. So he did score at a very respectable rate. He was playing well over 20 minutes a night for his team. That also factors in. So the production is undeniable, but it's also, I think, a cautionary story of what might also be sort of under the surface with Salin, because every time I watched him, like, I see a guy who can drive offense with his shot really, really well. I'm looking at some of his game-by-game data. He had at least 5 shots in let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, in 5 of the 7 games he played between February and March. He had 10 shots across 2 games in December at the junior level. Like, this is a guy who loves to shoot the puck. He's skilled, but I feel like in terms of the well-rounded approach to the game, it's still a bit of a work in progress. But I mean, if he was the guy that they drafted instead of Kenny Connors, I'd be like, okay, sure, at 103, fine, go nuts. So I think it's a good value pick, but I don't see a ton of NHL likelihood for Salin as he is now. But he's a good straight line skater. He gets around the ice pretty well. Defensive mobility and just defensive involvement is kind of lackluster, I would say. And his projectable puck skill is kind of iffy, but I liked this pick more than any other pick for LA this year in the draft outside of Jack Hughes at 51. But I also don't want to sass the rest of the guys they drafted too much. I mean, I looked at Jared Wright off and on over the year. He was a player after he was drafted. I'm like, I remember that name, and I don't know why. And I remember him being a guy who was at the All-American Prospects game and did stand out in that game. I really liked his performance in that game from what I remember. I don't think he scored as much as other USHL entries. I mean, re-entry players, he certainly didn't. But he drove really good shot differentials relative to his team. He's got some good north-south speed as well. He can get up the ice. He's fluid with his pivots on his feet. He covers ice really, really well, making himself a target and finding space and skating into it. I think Colgate University is a nice landing spot for him too. I think he'll get plenty of chances to play. I think he could at the very least become a good college player. I mean, he's a bit older for a re-entry that's re-entering for his first time, but that's not the end of the world. I mean, he's a good player. I'll be very curious to see what he can do in college with a team that should it be in a level of play and in the NCAA that works for him. At 180, they drafted Jack Sparks. He's big, he's 6'8", he plays in the OJHL and doesn't score. I don't know. He's another one of these guys where maybe he'll be a thing, but, I don't know. At 180, there wasn't that many guys at 180 where I'm going, you got to draft this guy. There's just guys that I like, personally, that I might have looked at maybe. But in terms of guys that were out there, Alex Pelevin, Servac Petrovsky, Brandon Lazowski, Alexis Gendron, who else? I mean, the guys that I like that went undrafted, who we'll cover in a later video. Cole Knuble, I thought would have been a nice pick for the LA Kings. Bo Jelsma maybe, but it's not the end of the world. But with Jack Sparks, I think there's a long way to go for him based on what I remember seeing of him with the Buzzers this year. Big, kind of rangy, but he's a blank slate. And speaking of which, Caleb Lawrence, if you ever want to know that pretty much anyone is available to be drafted, he's 6'7" and played 2 games this year. He got hurt back in October. I watched some footage of him in both of those games. He's a guy. He's big. He carries a lot of momentum. He gets pucks moving offensively with a bit of skill to get through traffic, but I don't have huge expectations, and no pun intended there. He's got reach for days. Like, he's got arms that are very long, and he's got a very tall body. But based on his actual play in hockey, there's not much I can say with much confidence. He's played 2 games in the last 2 seasons. Again, it's 215th overall, so it's not the end of the world, but there are players that went undrafted that played full seasons last season and this year with better resumes and better output and better upside, and teams go for guys like Caleb Lawrence. Look, it's not over. All the best to him. Hope he can figure it out. But even if he wasn't 6'7", anyone who has just played only 2 games in the last 2 years, it's always going to be a long shot for those types of players, especially when the only 2 games he played this year were in October. So anyway, we'll see what happens with him. I did not think LA had quite the draft that they could have had, even when they started at 51. I'm giving the LA Kings a strong 3D. Some of these guys, I'd be very surprised to see them become NHL players. I like Jack Hughes. I think Booth and Connors and Sparks and Lawrence all have a ways to go Jared Wright is an interesting one that I want to see in college for sure. You stash him away for a while, but I like Jared Wright. And Otto Salin, a good swing in that range, but I still see flaws in his game that when you look at his point production and what some people have been saying about him and that point production, I just don't really see that lining up quite the same. So they have a strong developmental system in terms of the number of prospects in their system, but based on the last 2 years, I wonder if there's been a bit of a pivot in a different direction, and we'll have to see how that goes. So they're right now sitting just above Edmonton here. I would say that they're roughly on par, but somewhere in there. Thank you very much for joining me. The next one is going to be the New York Islanders. So join me for that one, and we'll see you tomorrow.